The Seeking Eye Life Exploration podcast is and will always be free to access. But if you would like to support my work, please consider joining my Patreon or signing up on YouTube as a channel member. By doing so, you will receive exclusive benefits, including early access to future podcast episodes, access to hosted discussion groups, and access to non-podcast supplementary videos. So click the join button underneath this video to join as a YouTube channel member, or find the link to my Patreon page in the description. Thank you. Consciousness, everything we are, is produced by the brain. There's tons of evidence to suggest this, and the standard view is that there's no or very little evidence, at least in mainstream science, that there's no or very little evidence whatsoever that the brain can exist outside of a mind, the mind can exist outside of a brain, and therefore, once you die, you're gone, you're done, game over. What do you think about that view generally?
Well, yeah. Let me take it at the most general level. Science really got started mainly in the, say, 17th century, and it did so by essentially saying, well, let's put all this mind stuff aside for the time being and start working on nature. And what they meant by that was basically stuff that you can measure and then begin to construct a physics about, things that have properties like extension and mass and weight and so on. And so Galileo, introduced this distinction between primary and secondary qualities and all that. And it's only the primary qualities that they wanted to pursue. Did that very successfully, led to the Newtonian synthesis, produced all kinds of great advances, both intellectually and practically. But gradually transmuted somehow into a philosophical ideology. That is something that had begun as a kind of methodological decision, which helped precipitate the origins and growth of physics as we came to know it through the late 19th century. But took on this much more extreme character when it became modern physicalism, a sort of austere philosophical version of the materialism of previous centuries. Now, I think not only is that doctrine wrong, but it's had all kinds of bad consequences for civilization. I mean, it's had good consequences as well. Certainly, we don't want to discard all that. We have all kinds of things that make life a lot easier
and an incredible understanding of the mechanics of the universe, for sure.
Yeah. But it's clear that somehow the baby got tossed out with the bathwater, and we've got to find some way of bringing mind and consciousness back into our picture of science in a way that has not yet occurred, but seems to be, I feel, the first stirrings of real movement in that direction. I got into this business. I'm an experimental psychologist and neuroscientist by training, not a philosopher, certainly. And I got into this by way of parapsychology. The reason being that in that arena occur a bunch of things that, according to the prevailing view, just should not happen. And yet, I assure you that they do. I mean, just to be perfectly blunt about it, my informed and considered opinion on this subject after about 50 years in the business is that enough evidence has accumulated, both from spontaneous cases and field studies of various kinds, plus something like a couple of thousand experimental studies, that ought to be sufficient to convince any open-minded person who takes the trouble to study it that these things really do exist as facts of nature, and therefore our science is going to have to expand in some way in order to accommodate them.
And yet, still in the mainstream, any mention of parapsychology immediately invokes claims of pseudoscience or poor statistics.
I mean, I think most scientists basically don't know anything about the subject. There's a small, noisy, and influential group of people who are, have made a career out of denying the existence of these phenomena. Um, but the evidence is there for those who are willing to look at it. That's all
And
there is
very,
to it.
very interestingly, on that subject, I've gotten quite heavily into researching out of body experiences, more contemporarily
Uh,
called astral projection. And one of the most common rebuttals is that no, it would be easy. Someone who can allegedly come out their body goes into a lab, sees a target, job done. Would be very easy to prove, and yet has never happened. So therefore, the inference there, therefore, being it's not anything more than fantasy.
well, there are quite a few published studies actually showing that it does happen. A lot of these are old reports of persons who deliberately projected themselves to some place where on some occasions there were multiple people present who all described seeing the projector at the place that he said he went to and wearing the same clothes and that kind of stuff. So there are quite a few reports of that sort. There are also at least a few experimental reports already, including, for example, one by Charlie Tart from back in the 1970s
Miss Z.
with Miss Z. You know about her. So, she had one in a week-long experiment in a sleep and dream lab. There was one occasion where she had an OBE and was able to report a five-digit number correctly with the numbers in the right order. Um, and there were some tiny possibilities of explaining that as being due to reflection or something. I don't take them very seriously,
And
frankly.
I'm consider myself very lucky in that I was able to talk briefly with Dr. Tart for the International
Oh,
Association of Near-Death Experiences before he passed. And
yeah.
although there are certainly, as you say, possibilities, for the want of a better term, that Miss C had concealed a mirror or seen something in a reflection, Dr. Tart was adamant that those kind of things, from his point of view as the person that actually conducted the experiments, are laughable,
Hmm.
laughably
Yeah.
implausible.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, that's good that you got to talk to Charlie. Good for you.
Such a nice
Good
guy.
industry there.
Mm.
The main reason, by the way, that there isn't a bigger experimental literature is that it's hard to find people who can really reliably just do it on demand and go to an agreed upon place. I think it will happen. We're constantly on the lookout in our own lab at UVA. Um, Let me just mention in passing here. I originally, well, I worked in parapsychology until about the late 1980s. Had to take a job in mainstream neuroscience to feed two kids. Did that for a number of years, then came back into parapsychology at University of Virginia. And one of my main reasons for going there was to attempt to resume a program of psychophysiological research on psi and altered states, psi conducive altered states of consciousness that we had started in the electrical engineering department at Duke back in the early 1970s. And we actually have created a facility. We have a lab in the downstairs part of our place, a very good EEG lab, which now also has some functional near infrared spectroscopy capabilities, so poor man's fMRI. And we have a direct connection by optic fiber from the lab to a satellite room upstairs and across the hall, as far away from the lab as we can get within the space that we own. And we want to run experiments in which good OBEers sitting in the lab being recorded from will go to that remote location where we will have put out targets or detectors of various kinds with the hope of not only verifying that they can correctly report distant targets, but that we can demonstrate that something is actually leaving the downstairs or arriving upstairs, which has never quite been done before, but that bears directly, of course, on the question of survival, whether there actually is something that can exit the organism as people almost invariably feel when they have these experiences.
And that becomes then a question of a perspective of idealism versus dualism. Dualism is often
Yeah.
looked down upon as a philosophy for reasons that I don't quite understand. But do you find the same?
Well, let's put it this way. I certainly started my career as a sort of implicit physicalist, like everybody else in graduate school at the time. Not because we had any big discussions about it and, drew that as a sort of logical conclusion, just kind of absorbed it from the atmosphere. Um, Once I um, had my own encounter with psi firsthand in experimental work that I did for J.B. Rhine, I realized, well, physicalism apparently has to go. What should take its place? For me, the next most natural, and still in some ways most natural, is dualism. I mean, invariably, when I'm thinking as a psychologist and doing experiments and stuff, I lapse into that way of thinking, bodies, minds,
Just
etc.
experientially, it's much more intuitive to
Yeah,
believe that there's two aspects of us.
yeah. I mean, dualism is certainly the man in the streets naive philosophy. However, I have become convinced over the years that once you abandon physicalism, there really is no place to stop short of its full-fledged opposite, some kind of realist idealism. And it's the realist part that's the hardest to deal with. That is, let's say there is some giant consciousness at the bottom or the top of things, depending on your spatial metaphors. How does it produce both us and the world that we live in and seem to share and can agree about most of the time? That remains a mystery. And yet there are people, of course, who have had the experience. They, just as you ordinarily wake up from a dream and realize that, hey, that was a dream. Now I'm in reality. We have awakened from what you think of as reality, and it's just as illusory as the dream.
Very commonly
I take
reported
that
in
seriously.
mm,
I'm
and
sorry?
it's very commonly reported in near-death experiences, especially. I spoke with Dr. Eben
Yeah.
Alexander, who sends his regards, by the way, um,
Oh,
who mentioned exactly that. There's this reality is nothing compared to the experience of
mhm.
realism on the other
Yeah.
side, whatever that means. Um,
Yeah. It was a terrible hatchet job produced by, what was it, the Atlantic, I think, maybe a guy named Luke Dietrich.
Dietrich, the Esquire,
Dietrich, yeah, yeah, and there was a rebuttal to it by Robert Mays
Mays,
and
that's
his
right.
wife, yeah, which was, I thought, very good and very thorough. But lots of people hear about the hatchet job, probably not so many about the rebuttal, which is unfortunate.
And
We'll,
yeah,
we'll,
if you were to read the Esquire article, you would be convinced that Eben
Esquire,
was
yeah.
a you would be convinced that Eben was a disgraced neuroscientist who wrote a book to try and make money out of it, and that would
Yeah,
seem very reasonable from just reading the Dietrich article. But
yeah.
as I always advise my followers, if you've got for example, a study, read the study and the rebuttals to it and the commentary on
Mhm.
it, because if you base your idea on mainstream media, who are out for views and clicks and
You bet.
watches, will sensationalize anything. And a good example of that is the recent studies with Gmo Borjigin, who I reached out to have on the show, but she was just too busy. Fair enough. Regarding her discovery of EEG spikes of gamma activity post cardiac arrest, I believe. I can't remember exactly, which was very interesting because, of course, gamma
In rats.
waves. Because sorry,
In rats.
in rats and in comatose patients recently, wasn't there?
Well,
But anyway, the point.
honestly, I think
Well,
I think that stuff is totally insubstantial. And there wasn't really an increase in gamma. There was an increase in uh, a particular measure that they found increased at certain very particular frequent. Well, it's a long story here. In fact, I think Bruce Grayson and I are going to write a generalized rebuttal of that whole class of published reports on brain flash at the moment of death and all that.
that'd be very interesting, because from the initial perspective, especially again from the media um, coverage of it, as well as reading the study initially, I suppose, without knowing the full context of it. As we know, gamma activity is generally linked to heightened cognition, so a spike of brain activity at death in gamma would reasonably lead one to conclude that, well, there we go, there's the near-death experience and the increased lucidity, etc.
Well, I strongly disagree with that whole approach, and I think we can prove that it's insubstantial.
That'd be very
Long
important.
story.
Very long
Yeah.
story. Interesting.
Now, she seems to me a very determined, entrenched physicalist who's desperate to find some kind of physical explanation for NDEs. And I don't think it's there to be found.
And there are some, some interesting individuals as well in studies that have been done. There's the Borjigin ones. Also, very often cited is Charlotte Martial and.
Well, I've seen that new paper of hers, and I think that's very insubstantial as well.
Which one was that?
Oh, I don't have it right in front of me. I've got a file full of stuff. It was 2025, though. It came out recently.
I don't think I've seen that one. I'll have to have a look.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a new model. It's got some sort of theatrical name. I forget.
I might have seen that. I can't recall exactly, but I thought it was someone else. But also Olaf Blanke with his temporal parietal junction stimulation OBE paper is also a very highly cited one, as evidenced.
Yeah, I mean, this points to the politics of science and who gets access to journals and that sort of thing. I mean, we've published criticisms of the Blanca stuff, which I think are quite devastating, but does anybody read that? I don't know.
That's the problem, isn't it? Is coming to an uninformed opinion without reading both sides of a sensationalist argument. So that'd be interesting. That's a very often cited one that Olaf Blanke has induced an out of body experience. So what are your views on that conclusion from his study?
Well, Bruce Grayson in particular has shown that what happened was not anything like a normal out of body experience. To call it that is really a stretch. And that's been true of a lot of these attempts to reduce NDEs to some other physically explainable phenomenon, like pilots undergoing huge G forces and that sort of stuff. The phenomenology is very different. Same for DMT experiences and other kinds of psychedelic experiences. Yes, there's some overlap, but they're clearly not full-fledged NDEs as defined by, for example, Bruce's scale, the Grayson scale, which has good psychometric properties. So, I understand why people want to save physicalism. It's explained a lot. There's a lot of great stuff in it, but I think it ultimately fails, and we're going to have to face up to that conclusion.
And I think folks are generally kind of afraid about an imaginary issue, which would be that everything we understand about the science and the material world will have to be discarded in face of a new, which it wouldn't. Yeah. Because physicalism works for most things. It just is adding an extra layer on top.
Apples still fell out of trees when quantum theory superseded classical physics. The same will be true with the expanded science that we're groping toward.
So, there are other examples that I've seen of claims made for a physicalist interpretation or explanation, which seem to be different to the phenomenology, although conflated, which is another one is Dr. Susan Blackmore's idea of what causes the tunnel, which is, you probably know the argument better than I do. But from what I could read, although certainly very interesting and plausible, is not the phenomenology that's reported as a tunnel.
Yeah, that's a small piece of the puzzle. I mean, NDEs, to my way of thinking, deep NDEs are essentially mystical experiences that occur under suboptimal circumstances where you almost die in order to have it. Mystical experiences in the course of our work on these books have emerged as really kind of the key because they can, we think, properly be understood as windows into deeper parts of reality that we normally don't have access to. How do you prove that? Well, I think what's been overlooked historically from William James on When James, his mysticism chapter in the varieties of religious experience, he didn't mention this, but I'm sure he knew it, that there's a strong overlap between mystical experiences and psi experiences. There's tons of psi going on in the mystical literature. Uh, most, at least a lot of quite prominent scholars of religion are clearly very uncomfortable looking at that aspect of their subject matter because they've been cowed by their physicalist colleagues into believing that no, nothing like that can possibly be real. So stay away from it. I mean, the treatment of the third book of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, for example, where he has this vast catalog of paranormal abilities or siddhis that you get to by developing the capacity for samadhi, deliberately entering into a sort of higher altered state. This is great stuff, and it's largely been either ignored totally or when looked at, pathologized and marginalized in, I think, totally inappropriate ways.
And you certainly have motivation to do that from both a stringent materialistic science point of view and a fundamental religious point of view, both of which
Yeah.
are very threatening to those ideas.
Yeah, we tend to find ourselves in this sort of gray zone between those forces and quite tiny by comparison. So it can be pretty scary sometimes.
For sure, and especially trying to work in an academic way on those things,
Yeah.
getting funding,
Mhm.
getting approval, and keeping your
Yeah.
job at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, funding for parapsychology research is almost entirely private funding. There has been things like Stargate, for example, which went on for years, only sort of rumored for most of us, but that was quite
And that's
well funded by the government.
and that's quite an interesting one because again, the claim there is that it was shut down because it was all found to be nonsense. Effectively, what they were looking for. That's the popular idea.
Yeah, that's baloney. There's a 2 or 3 volume history now of Stargate, which should correct all that.
I'll have to have a look. So that's one of the things that I kind of looked into a little bit more, starting on the out of body experience interest, because that's obviously
Mhm.
related, that remote viewing, etc. Um, and all I could really find is that yes, the CIA had this, but they cut it because it was nonsense. So I'll have to have a look at that document then. I haven't
Mhm.
seen it. So again, coming back to the general idea that the consensus of science and neuroscience, especially related to this, is that somehow, in a way we don't understand, the brain is so complex that essentially it gives rise to this magic thing called consciousness in a way
Yeah.
that we don't know, but will understand in the future. What is some of the evidence that is put forward for that interpretation when it's compared to the supposed lack of evidence for an individual mind as a separate thing?
Um, I'm not
As in,
really sure
yeah, is there anything kind of
there's
more? Because when I put this into living in 2025, I put this into ChatGPT and asked it, what's the evidence and why
Mhm.
is it? And other than correlation, which I argue can be used both ways, it came up with the experiments done by Libet, I think, which allegedly showed that brain activity precedes a decision or a will,
Oh,
and therefore that's more of a causational link rather than a correlation.
mhm. Well, those studies have been interpreted in both ways. I think it's a terrible model of voluntary action. Um, this is a huge subject, and it's one that I'm not really
The subject of free
entirely up to
will.
date on. I've long since concluded that, hey, get used to it. Free will is for real. Not that we are completely free. Certainly, everybody agrees at this point that lots of what we do is controlled by things that we don't even know about, our history, our genetics, our,
Oh, for sure. But
conditioning
ultimately,
history.
if you have a decision that can go one of two ways, you have the ability to make that decision.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think, well, David Ray Griffin has called that one of the elements of what he calls hardcore common sense that can't be denied in a self-consistent way. People write these 400 and 500 page books. Whitehead remarked at one point, uh, scientists, um, let's see, how did he phrase this? It was beautifully Whiteheadian. Scientists animated by the purpose of proving themselves purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study.
In parapsychology, the general, again, the idea, other than it being pseudoscientific, is that any effect that is found is so small that ultimately it could be just, disregarded as chance or a blip in statistics. What kind of evidence in parapsychological studies do you think are the strongest to show that the effect is valuable?
Well, let me say, first of all, that uh, there are really two arenas in which that complaint arises. One is the modern group of PK studies using random number generators, where you expect to flip a head or a tail 50%, and the um, deviations in the intended direction are often fraction of a percent, but involving thousands or sometimes millions of trials. And there, certainly that subject gets into the weeds of how the RNGs actually operate and all that kind of stuff. And it is true that a lot of the early work involving cards and dice throwing and that sort of thing involves small effects and large numbers of trials, but not always. There have been a number of exceptional performers over the years who produced much bigger effects. One of these was the guy that I met about a month after I started working for J.B. Rhine, a guy named Bill Delmore, who at the time was a law student at Yale, who turned out to be able to do practically anything we asked him to do, starting with a device that had been built by Helmut Schmidt. This was a physicist who had worked at Boeing, had recently become the director of Rhine's laboratory in Durham. This is after Rhine had left Duke and was functioning privately. This was a four-choice machine. It had, from the subject's point of view, it's a box that has four colored lights and four correspondingly colored buttons. And the subject's task is to push a button corresponding to the target, which will be picked by the machine. Very simple. Helmut carefully constructed the thing, tested it in the absence of subjects, and under those conditions, it reliably exemplified these, binomial statistics of a forced choice situation. Helmut had spent a couple of years looking around for people who could do better than that. He had found a couple and reported on them. They could produce deviations in the intended direction, plus or minus, on the order of 1 or 2% for thousands of trials. Okay. Against that background, in one day to our institute comes Bill Delmore, sits down at the table, sees the machine sitting there. Oh, what's that? And Helmut explained it to him. So he proceeded to tell us his life story over the next hour or so, and from time to time would reach out and push a button. And before long, it was quite obvious that he was doing way better than 25%. And in fact, over the whole hour, he produced 180 hits and 508 trials, which is over 35%. And when you do the statistics on that, we might have expected to observe a performance like that or better once in 10 million reruns of the experiment.
So pretty significant.
Yeah. And there are plenty of other things like that in the history of parapsychology. There are some wonderful spontaneous cases involving remote viewing, or sometimes even precognitive remote viewing. So again, it's part of the larger story. That kind of complaint is made by people who don't know the whole subject very well at all.
And a lot more recently has been the work of the Ions, Dean Radin, and the notorious case of Daryl Bem, who was attacked quite hard with his statistics. Oh, yeah. What kind of work is being done at the moment? And what do you think about the Bem critiques?
Uh, well, my understanding is that there have now been something upwards of 100 replications of Bem's work, and a modest proportion of those have been successful. So I don't think the situation there is nearly as bad as many critics say it is. But again, I'm not keeping up with it. Once I got going on this book stuff, I really kind of lost touch with a lot of the goings on in the experimental world. Dean Radin, on the other hand, is a good authoritative source on all that. He's got a new book just coming out. I think it's called Real Magic or something like that. Yeah. Um, Dean is a one-man army. I mean, that guy is enormously productive and really smart.
And again, it's easy to
So,
critique someone without knowing them. You know, one
mm,
can always claim bias or faulty issue or faulty practices, but when you know the guy, you can say,
yeah,
very, very unlikely.
yeah. Actually, let me go back to Bem for a moment. I mean, Daryl Bem was a very well-established social psychologist at Cornell, uh, and he was publishing in probably the top journal in that area. Rumors got out ahead of time, and things happened like letters going to the New York Times from people like Doug Hofstadter saying this is a calamity. Science will collapse if we allow this to. I mean, really crazy stuff. It brings out the worst in people. But there was because Daryl Dem had such a big presence already in the scientific world that he attracted a lot of attention that, lesser persons like myself would not get.
He couldn't be as easily dismissed offhand.
Mhm.
Mm.
Let me just mention one more thing on this evidence stuff. These kinds of discussions are focused too much on hitting per se, direct hits. Like take in the forced choice world, for example. I mean, Rhine had very limited ideas, both experimentally and statistically, but he carefully developed a small set of experimental procedures that were reliable, and he worked those to death, and not just to provide evidence of excess hitting, but other kinds of systematic effects in the context of forced choice experiments. For example, terminal salience, tendency for scores to be higher at the beginnings and ends of runs. Consistent missing, where subjects aren't when they're missing the target, they consistently associate that target with some other response among the available ones. In fact, we had examples of that with this guy, Bill Delmore, that I studied. Uh, we, based on our initial stuff at the Rhine lab, we got a small grant from Harvard, which allowed him to take a year off, come back. We did a bunch of experiments with playing cards with him. He could get playing cards in an ESP test at about 3 times chance expectation, which in a small number of trials adds up in a hurry. This is 1 in 52 instead of 1 in 5 probability of hit. But we were particularly interested in how did he do it? And he kind of told us what he was doing, and we could partially corroborate that just by looking. Uh, he would close his eyes, and what he said he was doing was waiting for imagery to come by. And then once he had one that he thought was a good one, then he would open his eyes and report the result. So we did a parallel study in which he got to look at tachistoscopically displayed, briefly displayed images of the same targets. And there he made lots of systematic errors of the sorts you'd expect. Face cards get mixed up, especially if they're the same color, things like that. Well, it turned out that he made similar mistakes in the ESP condition where he was strictly deprived of visual access to the cards. And to my way of thinking, that verified a key element of his description of the mechanism by which he produced these results. Yeah, I was telling you about other systematic effects in forced choice
That's right.
experiments,
Mm-hmm.
and there are a bunch of them. Psi missing is another one. All of those things contribute to the science of the subject in a way that hasn't been as widely appreciated, in my opinion, as it should be. Excess hits aren't the only thing going on.
Indeed. So, by extension, as I always ask guests, because I find it interesting that it's still an argument, is is the argument that if this stuff really existed, then someone would have won one of the many cash prizes that are out there
Oh,
for
yeah.
showing a phenomenon.
Oh my gosh. Darren, I have to say that, at this stage in my career, I'm just absolutely uninterested in fighting rearguard actions against people who are not just skeptical in the original sense, but deniers who make a living, whose principal occupation is resisting evidence for psi phenomena. That's one. I mean, casinos, for example, are certainly very adept at creating conditions not conducive to psi performance. Uh, why hasn't somebody, won something or other? I don't know. All kinds of scenarios could be imagined. Maybe there's something in the universe that prevents that kind of abuse of psi. Maybe it's supposed to be used for better things. Let's hope so. I mean,
Okay, so I suppose moving on to a related subject is another argument that the evidence, especially for subjective phenomena, not so much psi, like near-death experiences, like say astral projection or out-of-body experience in these transient realms, etc., aren't valuable because they're anecdotal in nature and so provide no evidence. What do you think to that argument?
anecdotal, that's a word that's been greatly abused in modern times. It actually means unpublished, and many of these things that are called anecdotes have been published in considerable detail. Furthermore, the case material as a whole has certain recurring characteristics, including an association with psi phenomena, which provide independent verification of central parts of them. So, again, I feel that that kind of argument is just an attempt to get rid of evidence that's unwelcome. That challenges a point of view that somebody holds on to for some quasi-religious reasons. And it is definitely the case, in my opinion, that for a lot of people, and in particular for lots of scientists, physicalism amounts to a secular religion, a secular faith. And people who challenge it are not welcome, regarded as heretics who need to be, isolated and destroyed.
Mm. And it's
So,
interesting because a lot of the studies that I see trying to explain some of these phenomena physically always seem to ignore or work around the veridical perception aspect, which to me is the most
yeah,
important aspect of them, at least to ground them
yeah,
in reality.
yeah. We tried to make the argument, people responding to reported psi events and near-death experiences, for example, in cardiac arrest cases where the conditions thought by most neuroscientists to be required for any sort of consciousness have been degraded or abolished entirely. And yet people were reporting not only experiences, but the most intense and transformative experiences of their entire lives, essentially a mystical experience, again, under these horrible conditions where you almost die. And lots of times critics will say, well, that's just an anecdote. It's as though all the other evidence for the reality of psi can be ignored. Probably they know practically nothing about it.
Mm.
Well, I mean,
Indeed,
that's a big mistake.
attacking one case in only one area
Yeah,
of research.
yeah.
Yeah,
By the way, going back to anecdotes again, the I think it was George Mandler who maybe was the first guy to say the plural of anecdote is not data. That's actually a total distortion of the original quote, which was that the plural of anecdote is data. I don't have it right in front of me, but I know that's
hmm.
the real history of that expression.
Hmm. Interesting. So
It
somehow
started
it's
out
been
being,
completely reversed.
yeah, completely reversed.
Hmm.
There are some very good books, by the way. Gosh, again, I don't have this stuff right in front of me. I can't remember things. Books by people who have looked at the critical literature and critiqued it. There are several of them. Oh, good place to find them would be through the website of the SPR in London.
And
Very good ones.
that's discussing the cases that we were talking about.
Critiquing the
Critiquing.
critics.
Ah, I see.
By the way, I had one experience of this type early in my career with Bill Dunbar. Yeah, it was an interesting one. We did our work 72, 73, 74 in there. In 1978, there appeared in Science an invited article by a man named Percy Diaconis.
The journal Science.
Yeah. It's called Statistical Problems in ESP Research. And this person talked about three things, one of which was my work with Bill Delmore. It turned out that in spring of 1972, after our first encounter with him, I took him up to Harvard, where I had done my graduate work, and put him in front of a whole bunch of faculty members in my department that I, had known until quite recently. And it was on the strength of that we got this small grant that allowed him to take a year of absence from law school and do the other things we did. And nothing unusual about the kid. We met in the 15th floor meeting room of William James Hall, and we got the money. So, it seemed like it went pretty okay to me. Anyway, in this article, I left out one vital thing. It turns out that Percy Diaconis, who was a statistician and also a magician, was a graduate student at that time with Fred Mosteller, who was the guy from whom I learned statistics, chairman of the statistics department. I had invited Fred Mosteller, and he kind of surprised me by saying, well, that stuff was all disproved by Edgar J. Coover in 1920 something or other, or 30 something or other, I guess it wasn't. That kind of surprised me, but I mean, he didn't come. But apparently what he did was he sent Percy Diaconis, unbeknownst to me. And so here, 6 years later, appears this article in which he basically says, well, there are all these reports about this guy, but I know the true story. And then he proceeds to talk about this meeting that week, a totally informal event on the 15th floor of William James Hall, where Bill first did a couple of his, things that he spontaneously does with cards, and then did a little bit with a four-choice machine. So Diaconis essentially said, well, the reports describe perfectly acceptable scientific conditions, but I know what really happened. And he proceeds to describe one of these things, that spontaneous things with playing cards, how he would have done that as a magician, suggesting, that there must be some similar explanation for everything else, including the things that he just described as being perfectly okay. Anyway, so that appeared on a Thursday. I submitted my 18-page rebuttal to that 1/3 of that article the following Monday, relying on the masthead, which says that, manuscripts submitted as papers will be reviewed in a timely manner, blah, blah, blah. 6 months later, I got a phone call from the letters editor saying which paragraph from my 18-page rebuttal I would like to appear in the letters section. So you don't need many of those to decide it's not really worth your time.
No, understandable. Yeah. And that was his criticisms were based off of one experience he had with you in a non-scientifically controlled manner, disregarding all the others that were.
Yeah. Even though we said clearly at the beginning of the event, hey, we're just kind of giving you an idea of things that are going on.
Yeah. And he used that as the basis for his critique, which is rather disingenuous. Yeah.
Yeah.
So going to quotes, as you mentioned, the origins of anecdotes and data, etc. What's your thoughts on the other very often quoted quote? Extraordinary data requires
extraordinary evidence.
Proof. Yeah, where I'm going.
Yeah, well, there's been some debate about that. I mean, for starters, I think Hume's argument is transparently bogus. That's the one that everybody relies on. And there have been articles about that. It's been dumped on by philosophers and parapsychologists and historians of science. I mean, certainly we want to make our evidence as good as possible. I personally think that more would be done for acceptance of psi by discovery of a theory that would allow for its existence without contradicting other things that we know about physics and so on. than any amount of continued data collection under of the present sorts. Maybe somebody will think up some more powerfully decisive kind of ESP experiment that can succeed. We'll see. I mean, if we get better at producing phenomena on demand, in controlled conditions, that will help. And I certainly encourage people to keep on. Nobody knows what's going to work best. I've made arguments to the effect that we should really bear down on altered states because the psi will likely come along for the ride based on the natural history of the phenomena. I could send you a monograph actually that well, Australian cultural anthropologist Ralph Locke and I wrote back in 1980. It was kind of a pep talk for parapsychologists along those lines, surveying the history of the stuff and in particular emphasizing the whole shamanic tradition as embodying all kinds of procedures for inducing altered states that were expected to produce socially useful consequences like finding game or identifying who did that terrible thing or whatever. Yeah, let me make a note. I'll send you that.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd appreciate that. And talking along those lines of developing a theory as to how these things could work, I've always found it fascinating from a psychological point of view that the notion that the brain generates consciousness is the go-to assumed.
Oh yeah.
And yet, from what I can see, there's just as much of a lack of mechanism as to how the brain, a non-conscious assortment of matter, an assortment of non-conscious matter, can give rise to consciousness, as there is no mechanism for how it could exist externally. And yet, the generation hypothesis is taken seriously, and the external is not, despite both of them having no mechanism whatsoever.
It's because the production model is consistent with the prevailing physicalism. Even though, Karl Popper, in his book with John Eccles back in the 1970s, I guess it was, The Self and Its Brain, clearly identified that as what he called promissory materialism. And in fact, David Chalmers, yeah, let me say this is significant. One of the reasons for the kind of shifting winds is that parapsychologists are no longer so alone. It used to be us in our little rowboat trying to steer the Titanic and all that. But now there's some other boats in the neighborhood trying to do the same thing, some quite a bit bigger than ours. One is philosophy of mind. Now, David Chalmers gets a lot of credit for identifying the hard problem, but it was clearly put forward by Leibniz in the monadology, where he talks about the mill. You think of the brain as being like a gigantic mill, so you can walk in and look around. You wouldn't see anything that would explain to you why consciousness is associated with any of that. It was given a much more modern formulation as early, at least, as mid 19th century by what's his name? British, very distinguished Tyndall, John Tyndall, has a very similar kind of statement, specifically in the context of brain physiology. All these neurochemical things are going on, but we have no idea how to get from that to consciousness.
Indeed, and I do like the metaphor that Bernardo Kastrup uses, who I spoke with a while ago on this. He's probably mentioned it to you as well. The metaphor of taps and pipes.
Oh yeah.
I think that's a good one because at the core, as we know, the brain, as you know, as a neuroscientist, the brain is binary, effectively on or off, action potential or no action potential. And it's like saying, if you have a massively complex planet-sized arrangement of taps and pipes and pressure valves, knowing it's just pipes and water, you turn the pipes on or off in a very specific way. Can you imagine that becoming conscious?
Yeah.
Because it's the same idea.
Yeah, really.
And it also, I see the hypocrisy in those that say, well, to suggest that there's life after death, or that the brain of consciousness can exist outside of the brain, you're invoking magic. And I would say, well, aren't you invoking magic as well to say that the brain can produce this? But again, it's very, understandably, it's a one-way kind of view. You don't see the errors with your own thinking, but you can be skeptical of other ideas, which is a natural human thing, as you know as a psychologist.
Yeah, for sure. William James, is the one who really pinpointed the logical issues here in his Ingersoll lecture of 1888, maybe 78, somewhere in there, um, on two supposed objections to the doctrine of immortality. The first was he said, okay, we all agree that there's normally correlations between brain activity and mental stuff. You know, you get whacked on the head hard enough or take the right pill or whatever, things change.
Drink enough
Certainly,
alcohol.
hmm, for the
Drink enough alcohol.
better. They said, and we usually suppose this is consistent with the picture that the brain is manufacturing consciousness. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can interpret the correlation a different way, which is to say that those correlations um, reflect the sort of arrival of conscious mentation that might originate somewhere else outside the brain.
And the
This,
analogy I usually look at for that is if you pour coffee onto a radio
oh
motherboard,
yeah,
the signal's still there, but the expression of it is greatly
yeah. Of
reduced.
course, James didn't have that metaphor available to him, so
No.
he used other ones. But yeah, that's perfectly appropriate. And James said explicitly, well, it sounds metaphorical and hard to understand, but hey, the regular idea is equally hard to understand. And this one might allow you to explain a bunch of other things that are clearly unexplainable in terms of the first, including the stuff being uncovered by Myers and company at the SPR. This is end of the 19th century.
What do you think about the use of Occam's razor to suggest that the brain producing consciousness is the most parsimonious and simple explanation?
Well, a proper theory should be as simple as possible, but no simpler, would have been Einstein's response to that. If we require the idea of an extra cerebral consciousness in order to explain other stuff, then we must have it. I mean, take an example, NDEs occurring under cardiac arrest, for example. Here's something, this is a very obvious, simple prediction of the production model. Cardiac arrest, no experience. A Not quite a prediction, but a possibility consistent with the alternative position is that experience might occur. If the different kind of theory, very unlikely according to the mainstream position, but we have evidence for that, which clearly conflicts with obvious expectations derived from the production model, but yet consistent with this alternative picture, which is not yet fleshed out in sufficient detail, but we're getting there. And for your information, right now reorganizing my office to manage the production of a book 4 in our series, which I think will get a good bit closer to what we're looking for, which is an improved philosophical cosmology that along the lines developed so far, but much more detail, connecting in a deep way with modern physics.
Looking at things from a quantum physics perspective,
Yeah,
I'd imagine. I don't know much about that.
well, that's a huge subject and it's technically beyond me, but we have good uh, partners in that world. And it turns out there's a little sort of deviant subculture within the field of foundations of physics that is pushing the view that to obtain a correct understanding of quantum theory, we need to expand our ontology in a particular way, namely, following Heisenberg, to allow that reality consists not just of actuality, what we find around ourselves, but potentiality. And the realm of potentiality, which must be admitted to ontological parity with actuality, can be a lot bigger and a lot stranger than actuality in ways that will enable us to explain some of these things. And for a source of that, I refer you to a book by a man named Tim Eastman. It's called, what is it called? Where is it? I got it here someplace. Untying the Gordian Knot, published in 1920. He advances in, yeah, it's very a lot of it is grounded in process philosophy, Whitehead type thinking. But he knows a lot about science and math.
That's what we need, certainly. I mean, for me, quantum physics is far beyond my scope of knowledge outside of the very basics.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I can't really give much comment on that side of things. But I know that folks like Deepak Chopra speak a lot about it, and a lot of people are turned off by that sort of thing, for
Well,
reasons
too
that.
many psychologists talking about quantum theory these days, for sure. And quantum theorists tend to get real upset. But, the people that we're working with for this book, they are very prominent people in that world.
And so they have the foundational knowledge to put forward
Yeah.
arguments reasonably so.
Another one, by the way, is Federico Fagin. If you haven't, okay, you know about him.
I reached out to him and I'm looking to get him on the channel at some point, but I'm not hearing back from him. I'm assuming he's busy, but he's a very, very good mind.
Yeah. I mean, particularly because he's absolutely at the center of all this stuff going on in computer science, created the basis for it. Silicon Gate Junction, he invented it, along with designing and building several of the first microprocessors. But then he started having mystical experiences, which convinced him right away that, whoa, the physics I learned didn't include anything like this. This has to be built into our scheme of knowledge at a very basic level. And he's doing, I think, a terrifically effective job of promoting that vision. Whether his detailed theory holds together or not, that's a little beyond my capability to judge. But we got people involved with him. He's part of our this group.
And I'd imagine that as an engineer himself, he probably would have started life with a very physicalist idea of
Yeah.
things.
Although ironically, his father was apparently a scholar of Neoplatonism and actually wrote an Italian translation of the Aeneas.
I'm not familiar.
I mean, Plotinus, I think, is one of the um, re-emerging figures in the history of philosophy. I mean, he's kind of the culmination of the whole Platonic tradition. And I think elements of that tradition are going to come back into an improved uh, philosophical cosmology.
As I say,
Long
I'm not
story there.
overly familiar, so I can't really say much about that. But um, okay, so I suppose to finish off with, or to branch off a little bit, let's
Mm.
see other some other phenomena that are often seen, looked down upon, but in my opinion, as probably as well as yours, are very strongly evidential, and that is the studies on evidential mediumship and reincarnation, past
Mhm.
life memories. What are your thoughts on those two as evidential bases of survival of consciousness?
Well, I think both kinds of phenomena are extremely important. The real heyday of mediumship was mostly around the end of the 19th century and early part of the 20th, when the sort of great historical mediums were operative, like Mrs. Piper in particular, who, William James connected with her early on.
She was a physical
Uh,
medium, wasn't she?
no, she's a primarily mental medium. She well, apparently some member of James's family met her first and was impressed, and then he went and he was impressed. She became what he called his one white crow, namely that, if there's a proposition that all crows are black, all you need to find is one white crow, and that proposition falsified. She was that for him in regard to paranormal knowledge. Uh, so that stuff is extremely strong for those who, again, look at it. Hodgson's report on Mrs. Piper in 1898 is a high point of that literature. Also, Mrs. Sidgwick's report on Mrs. Piper and her controlling personalities and all that. Like a 615-page paper in 1930 or so, became convinced herself of the reality of survival, persuaded by Mrs. Piper in particular. And there were several others in that period, a few others later on. Ian Stevenson, our founder, who started the rebirth studies, really got that area going. Studied a couple of one Icelandic medium in particular, and published a couple of papers about him. So that literature, I think, has to be taken seriously. Now, there's a modern turn of experimental studies, a good one of which was done by my wife, actually. Um, the modern mediums tend to be not trance mediums, but they do their thing mostly kind of normally awake or something close to it. And the studies have involved, getting statements, having remote sitters evaluate the statements for accuracy in a blind fashion and so on. And they've tended to produce a modest amount of evidence supportive of the fact that they have some kind of ESP thing going, clearly,
Is
but
this
whether they
the
really,
is this the work of the Wimbridge Institute?
yeah, that's like it. Yeah, that's one of the main originators of this sort of work. My wife's study was rather like that, done through our group DOPS at UVA. For example, one of her mediums, a guy in England, Robert Brown, did 6 sessions. The transcripts were sent to uh, 6 sitters who rated them blindly, and all of the sitters picked their reading as the so probability 1/6 to the sixth basically for him. And the whole study was even still significant after taking him out. So there was good evidence that they're getting information about deceased persons, but it doesn't really address the fundamental question in survival research. The alternative to survival is what's called living agent psi, where everything that happens might be explained by psi in living persons, including particularly the medium. That's very hard to rule out decisively. I think there are things in the old mediumistic literature that point strongly in that direction. But people equally informed came down on opposite sides of that. Now, rebirth studies. I think that's a hugely important addition to the survival literature. There are now something over 2,500 cases worldwide that have been investigated, about 2,200 of which have now been coded and entered into a big database that we have at DOPS, which is starting to add to that literature. Most of the literature so far consists of case studies reporting on what was done and what happened, what the kids reported, and what could be verified, and so on. And again, I think people who take the trouble to study that stuff will find it persuasive. The new dimension is that with this database, you can start to build and test quantitative models, like what predicts how many statements the child will make and whether they'll be correct or not, or things of that sort, or the length of the intermission, which is wildly variable. The averages or the median is only something like 18 months, but lots are much longer than that.
And that's
Why is
that's
that?
from death to birth.
Yeah. Um, anyway, so yeah, I think the rebirth literature has added greatly to the strength of the case for survival. And of course, if I let me just say one more thing about that. I mean, one of the big points about these NDE cases occurring under conditions such as cardiac arrest is, in my opinion, they show that it is possible for conscious experience to occur in the absence of a normally functioning brain. And that removes a big logical obstacle to survival. It was the one that stopped Gardner, excuse me, burping wildly here. Um, Gardner Murphy described it as, what do you say, the immovable object being assaulted by the, what do you call it, overpowering evidence. Yeah, but I think it is now gone, and that indirectly supports the case for survival. That's part of the second thing that I'll send you an argument about that.
Well, from your many years of research, what would you consider the most compelling evidence that mind is not produced by the brain and may continue following death?
Well, I'd have to say that for me personally, these cardiac arrest NDEs are really the crux of the matter, and I think where real movement will occur. I mean, this stuff is coming right out of the heartland of contemporary biomedical science. we're getting better and better at retrieving people from the borderland of death, and they're coming back with these strange stories. I think there are going to be more and better stories of that sort as we go on. And I think doctors are becoming increasingly aware that this stuff is going on and more interested in hearing what patients have to say. Patients are becoming less worried about talking because they're not so afraid of being treated like they're screwballs, that sort of thing. So I think this is a growing edge of the whole subject that may prove decisive in coming years.
Or do you think to the argument on those experiences that they were near death, therefore they weren't dead, so this could be, anything?
I think that's a physiologically ignorant argument because the kinds of conditions that neuroscience has identified as required for consciousness are very complex things where the brain is enough normal to be able to support large scale patterns of correlations among brain areas. For example, how do you integrate a perceptual scene? You got to have, your hearing, your vision, different chunks of cortex all involved at the same time, somehow able to get together on what the story is out there, what's going on. And that's gone in cardiac arrest within seconds. 10 seconds.
And not including the gamma spikes, which by themselves wouldn't necessarily be sufficient for conscious experience.
I think those described effects are bogus, but I can't get into that.
But yeah, I'll look forward to your write up on that if you do that. I think.
By the way, the one attempt I made to get into that subject, the first report was from this guy Chawla over in Richmond, Virginia, nearby. They recorded from 6 patients who were on the verge of dying using the available EEG instrument, which had a packaged device to produce a certain measure of level of consciousness. This is for use in surgeries. It's proprietary. Nobody knows quite how it works, really. It's very sensitive to stuff like muscle artifact, which I think was responsible for probably everything they reported. But there was one patient for whom they had actual raw EEG, or said they did. I wrote to him and begged for that data. He couldn't produce it. I don't think he was hiding it from me. They just didn't really have it. Because I could have looked at that. I could have analyzed that data and seen if there were any such things.
And as a neuroscientist, you would know.
Yes. And using normal measures, not subject to all these peculiarities or a proprietary algorithm.